This video is made possible by our generous supporters on Patreon. Check out patreon.com/NWR for all the details. Banjo-Kazooie's release on the Nintendo Switch Online service marks one of the most interesting releases thus far for Nintendo's online subscription service. We've already seen some games that are being released for the first time in new regions via the service, and it's the most accessible way to play games like Star Fox 2 and Sin and Punishment. But Banjo-Kazooie is a bit of an odd bird. After initially being published by Nintendo on the Nintendo 64 in 1998, developer Rare was purchased by Microsoft in 2002, where Banjo-Kazooie would get its first re-release on the Xbox 360 in 2008. This version featured some light visual touch-ups, along with quality-of-life updates. That version of Banjo-Kazooie was then included in the 2015 release of Rare Replay on Xbox One. In 2019, this version was then updated again to support native 4K resolutions on select Xbox systems, including the Xbox Series X, which released in late 2020. It can also be played via the Xbox Cloud service with full touchscreen support for play on smartphones. Now, finally, in 2022, the original, non-updated N64 version arrives on Switch, with all of that service's expected updates, including a bump to 720p, save state support, and of course, portability. That's a pretty incredible journey that this game has taken to arrive back on a Nintendo console for the first time in nearly a quarter century. But does this N64 ROM present on Nintendo Switch Online still have value that isn't immediately eclipsed by the objectively superior Xbox version? I'm John Reardon, you're watching NWR TV. Join me as we delve into 3 different releases of Banjo-Kazooie, appreciate their differences, praise Rare's technical prowess, and explore the best way to return to what might be one of the greatest 3D platformers of all time. Let's start with the basics. All versions target 30 frames per second, with the Xbox version offering the smoothest overall performance, followed by Switch, and then the original N64 version. The difference between Xbox and Switch likely comes down to the difference between emulation and a more customized native port. The Switch version doesn't drop frames often, by any means, but it isn't quite as buttery as the Xbox version, which is about what you'd expect. The original N64 release of Banjo-Kazooie ran at 240p. As alluded to earlier, the Xbox versions range from 1080p on older machines all the way up to 4K on newer models such as the Xbox Series X. The Switch version runs at 720p, which is the standard resolution for N64 games on the NSO service, and the native resolution of the Switch's screen, meaning it looks particularly nice in handheld mode. Now, a boost to a full 1080 when playing docked would certainly be appreciated for this and the rest of the N64 library, but at 720p this is still a tripling of the original resolution. Interestingly, you can actually appreciate this for yourself just by pausing the game. When you press the pause button, the game essentially takes a temporary screenshot and uses that as the backdrop behind the menu. This screenshot is stored at a resolution of 320 by 240. Now, on the original Nintendo 64, this matches the resolution of the game, meaning that outside of a slight judder, it's not really detectable on original hardware. On Switch, however, where the game is being rendered for a 1280 by 720 screen, the image is still set to save at that original resolution. It's a fun way to compare just how much of a difference that resolution bump actually makes. It's also worth noting that this trick does not work on the Xbox version, as rather than emulating the N64 ROM, the Xbox version has been significantly modified in a lot of small ways, including the resolution of that pause screen image. The subtle modifications made to the Xbox version are where we'll start to notice some other visual differences. Of course, any reference to Nintendo was removed, from obvious things like various Nintendo logos in the intro, to smaller changes like the removal of the Game Boy startup sound when selecting the third save slot from the main menu. When it comes to actual gameplay, at a glance, the Switch and Xbox versions look pretty similar, save for the difference in aspect ratio, with the Xbox version offering a full 16:9 image. But look a little closer and you'll notice another nice change made for the Xbox version. Draw distances have been universally pushed way out to the point where nothing ever really disappears. This is great for spotting distant collectibles. I should also note that in the Xbox version, when you pick up a music note, it stays gone even if you leave and re-enter the stage, making tracking down which ones you haven't picked up yet a lot easier. So if you notice notes missing from the Xbox footage, that isn't a draw distance issue, it just means I've already picked them up. Take a look at this shot from the lighthouse at the top of Treasure Trove Cove. The resolution bump for both the Xbox and Switch version make a huge difference, and that extended draw distance on Xbox really changes the functionality of high overlooks like this one. It turns them into a great way to look out and spot collectibles you may have missed. But speaking of functionality, that extended draw distance does also expose a limitation faced by the Xbox version. In order for enemy behavior to be consistent with the original version, when an enemy moves past its original draw-in point, it simply stays still in a looping idle animation. We can actually spot this happening in the original too, though it's easier to see in Switch thanks to the resolution increase. The freeze actually occurs just before the enemy moves out of view. Placing the freezing point just before the character would be culled from view may have been an intentional decision to keep distant enemies from constantly popping in and out of the player's view while the player is standing still. Other improvements to the Xbox version include updates to select textures, a higher resolution font for text boxes, and higher resolution character portraits. Some of these portraits look like they may have been redone from scratch, while others look to have been artificially upscaled. The result in both cases is pretty mixed. I'm really not a fan of how Banjo and Kazooie themselves turned out on the status bar, nor Gruntilda in her speech bubble. She looks like a very rough upscale, rather than matching the actual 3D model that her original portrait was very likely rendered directly from. I appreciate the effort to upgrade other 2D elements such as collectibles, but when it comes to actual character portraits, I think I'd rather stick with the blurry but not offensively smoothed out versions on Switch and the original N64 release. Now, as for this game's place in history, throughout the 90s and into the 2000s, Rare was known for their unique command of hardware capabilities. From Donkey Kong Country to Conker's Bad Fur Day, and from Star Fox Adventures to Banjo-Kazooie Nuts and Bolts. This holds true today, with Rare's extremely successful pirate sim Sea of Thieves featuring incredibly dynamic water simulation that is actually not that demanding on less capable machines. Amid all of that, I feel like Banjo-Kazooie never really gets the recognition it deserves. But a lot of the techniques that I feel Rare demonstrated a real mastery of in Conker's Bad Fur Day were present here, though admittedly in a lesser form. I could make a whole video on Rare's graphical techniques, and one day I hope to do that, but let me just quickly touch on a couple of their tricks here that I think you might find interesting. Firstly, Rare was one of the few companies working on the Nintendo 64 to make extensive use of vertex animation, a technique whereby, in addition to traditional skeletons driving the movement of a character, individual vertices would be animated on an object. This is extremely helpful for smooth, dynamic motions like cloth or complex facial animations. As for what a vertex is, if you think of a 3D model kind of like a quilt with a bunch of squares, then a vertex is the point at the corner of every square panel on that quilt. Now, in the case of most models on the Nintendo 64, this would generally be triangles, not squares, but you get the idea. The technique was commonly used on PlayStation games like Spyro or Crash Bandicoot, but often avoided on N64, largely due to the space it took up. You see, in traditional skeletal animation, you only need to store keyframes for large bones that would then control a large portion of the model, containing tens, if not hundreds, of individual vertices. In vertex animation, each keyframe would need to be stored for each vertex, meaning a complex animation involving a high-resolution model takes up quite a bit of space. Which, when you consider the restrictions of N64 cartridge sizes, explains why we didn't see it too often on that platform. So its presence in Banjo-Kazooie, along with other N64 Rare games, is kind of a treat. This technique will also factor into the next effect I want to mention, which is Banjo-Kazooie's approach to water, and specifically, how it's lit. You'll notice that this cannon, and other parts of the geometry here, are casting shadows on this water. Now, in reality, this isn't actually any sort of modern shadow simulation, rather it's painted directly onto the geometry during the texturing process. It's not a horribly uncommon technique for games in this era, though the relatively complex shape of the cannon's shadow is impressive. What really stands out to me here is the fact that this shadow casts both on the surface of the water and below the surface on the ground. For now, let's not even worry that the water has legitimate waves moving through it, which is also impressive, and let's just talk about how this lighting effect would have worked on the Nintendo 64. Normally, in an N64 game, if you plan to have a semi-translucent surface of water in your level, you'd create the geometry of the scene with no water, just the ground underneath. The water would then simply be a flat, semi-translucent surface that you would just kind of slide into the whole area at the appropriate height. This water could literally just be two triangles next to each other to make a square, and that's what you see in something like Ocarina of Time, and honestly, plenty of modern games that rely more on shaders than actual geometry to simulate their water. But we know those hard-edged shadows are painted directly onto the mesh, which means they would essentially have to build the shape of those shadows into the mesh for the water. So here's how they would have done that. First, they'd have built the room with no water and figured out where their shadows were going to land. They'd then subdivide the floor so that the polygons making up the floor would have edges exactly where those shadows fall. In some areas, this would just be a straight line, but in other places, like with this cannon, that would mean sculpting the shape of the cannon's shadow into the geometry of the floor, so that you could perfectly paint faces that would match the shape of the cannon. When that's complete, they'd texture the floor. The whole thing could have the same texture, but the polygons designed as the shadowed areas would have their color values set slightly darker. After that, they would make a copy of that floor geometry and raise it up to the water level and change the floor texture to a water texture, but leave those darker color values where they are, and make the whole thing semi-translucent. That would give you that multi-leveled shadow effect. But keep in mind that this isn't a static water surface, and to get a smooth rolling wave motion like we see in Banjo-Kazooie's water, you'd need to subdivide that mesh even further into a fairly dense grid, at which point, depending on how their engine worked, they'd either bring back in our old friend vertex animation and carefully animate each wave, or apply some sort of sine wave displacement across the entire thing, to essentially simulate the wave using a mathematic formula. All of that so that both the water and the ground below can receive the same fake shadow, and so that that shadow on the water surface can react to waves just like the rest of the water. Like I said, I could make a whole documentary on Rare's various graphical techniques. I mean, seriously, if you want to talk about Star Fox Adventures or Conquer Live and Reloaded, we can do that, but not right now. So it's 2022, and you've decided to play Banjo-Kazooie. Which version do you play? Well, of course, I'm always a huge fan of playing on original hardware. Seeing the game exactly as the original developers programmed it has a lot of value to me. Of course, that means experiencing both the good and the bad. When it comes to a modern, cleaned-up experience, the Xbox version of Banjo-Kazooie is excellently done. It nails a lot of the same subtle visual improvements that we noted in Skyward Sword HD and in the Super Mario 3D All-Stars collection, though some of these are a bit more subjective than others. But overall, it nails that feeling of looking like you remember it, not how it actually was. It also makes some great quality-of-life improvements. Not having to recollect every note if you leave a stage is a big upgrade. The Switch version then sits somewhere in the middle. It is the original ROM, with its various Nintendo homages intact, but without any of those updates from the Xbox version. That being said, it is of course portable, which is in and of itself a pretty big upgrade. Now yes, you can technically play the Xbox version portably via the xCloud, but your experience will be highly dependent on your individual internet connection, and even in the best case scenario, you'll likely come away with significantly more input latency than you'll find on Switch or really any other version. This choice of how to play is up to you and your particular needs, but I can't recommend enough that you do indeed play. This is an all-time classic 3D platformer, and its availability on two different modern consoles from two different companies is nothing short of incredible. Let's hope the positive relationship we see growing between Microsoft and Nintendo can continue, and other Rare classics can find their way to modern releases, and hopefully to Nintendo Switch. If you enjoyed this video, give it a like, and let me know what your favorite way to play Banjo-Kazooie is down in the comments below, and maybe what other rare games you'd like to see arrive on Nintendo Switch. If you have any questions about this, feel free to give me a shout on Twitter using the handle on screen, and you can chat with me and the rest of the staff about this or anything else Nintendo related using our Discord. There's a link in the description. Check out NintendoWorldReport.com for a whole lot more, and stick around for information on our Patreon. Once again, I'm John Rairdon, thank you very much for watching, and I will see you next time. This video was made possible by our generous supporters on Patreon. Did you know that Nintendo World Report is funded directly by fans like you? When you support Nintendo World Report on Patreon, you get immediate access to multiple exclusive podcasts every month, exclusive Discord channels, an early look at select content, and more, all for as little as $1 a month. Check out patreon.com/NWR for all the details.